famous map that we've all seen before. You know, here's the center of the universe in those days. Good old Great Britain here. And Darwin sailed over here to Bahia in Brazil. Didn't spend too long there. It was carnival time, you know. Parties all over the place. Didn't want to do that. No, he missed carnival. And then Rio, and then spent lots of time here in Patagonia, well, between La Plata and then up the coast of Chile, the Galapagos Island, and across. And he went through these various islands here, these atolls in the Pacific. And then they carried on, but the main part of the expedition was this part. And then they more or less came home straight away afterwards. Well, Fitzroy's, like any of these scientific expeditions, they had to write the report, okay, the deliverable, okay? And it just so happens that the previous captain of the Beagle did not produce the deliverable. I don't know what happened to him. But, so Fitzroy had to write not only the sort of the surveying and the sort of more physical science part of the voyage, but he also had to write volume 1, which was the part that was from the previous voyage that hadn't been written up. So Fitzroy, I don't know if you can read it from the back, but Fitzroy wrote this one, the previous one, and here you go, narrative of surveying voyages of His Majesty's ships, Adventure and Beagle, and blah, blah, blah. And this was published, okay? And people used to read these things the way they would read Harry Potter, I suppose. Everybody went and bought copies. Just amateurs and so on, because they were such interesting stories. And they were often adorned with a picture like this, because this is more interesting than a picture of a coral or a bug or something like that. And here's the one that Darwin wrote. This was volume 3 of the set, okay? And it's the Journal of Researches on the Geology and Natural History and blah, blah, blah of HMS Beagle, okay? And this book went through several, he wrote this a couple of years after he got back, okay? And it was widely read, and he revised it shortly afterwards, and it went through dozens and dozens of printings, and if you were the sort of person who liked to buy collections of books, you know, like the complete works of Shakespeare or the works of, you know, Dickens or something, you could buy complete works of science books that were meant for people, for the man on the street, and this was always one of them. I have a copy, and mine's from one of those sets from about 1890. And I was reading it just the other day to prepare for this talk, and I was really glad to get back into it because I'd forgotten so many of the things that Darwin had observed. It was very impressive. Well, the geological part of Darwin, and so really the first part of his trip, he spent a lot of time in Argentina. He went right up to the Andes. He traveled all over, so he wasn't stationed on board the ship all the time. And he collected samples and looked at the geology along the coast in particular. Now that part of Argentina, on the Patagonian coast, is terraced with fairly young sedimentary rocks. So when I say and they have fossils in them that are tertiary in age. So that means they're really less than 65 million years old. And on the whole, they're even younger than that. And they're sediments that came off the Andes on the eastern side. Okay? The Andes came up, and then these sediments were shed, and they were shed towards the Atlantic. And sea level had changed back and forth, of course. And so the terraces on Patagonia have fossils tens of millions of years old. And the marine fossils are similar to the ones in the sea, right there where the ship was. Now, the frontispiece of Lyell's Principles of Geology was a great inspiration of Charles Darwin. I think it's probably well known. This is the frontispiece, okay, of volume 1 of Lyell's book. And it's from a temple called Pizzuoli near Naples, okay, in Italy. And Lyell had gone down there in previous years and had a big tour through Italy, and it was really where his understanding of geology helped to sort of, well, congealed is the wrong term, but came together, okay? And what these columns do, there's an old temple that's ruined by earthquakes, many earthquakes. This is near Vesuvius, right, the volcano, is that there are several different levels of sea level, okay, marked on these pillars, okay, these columns. Sea level relative to the pillar, sea level rose and fell a couple of times. So this was important for Lyell to talk about Earth crustal movements, and he knew that with Vesuvius erupting and then going quiet again, that underneath was a magma chamber, expanding, contracting, and so the crust here was warping and doing that. Well, this idea of slow warping and sinking and subsiding and uplifting, that affected Darwin in his understanding about sea level change, and particularly the fossils that were found along the coast. Now, nobody had really been there before in Argentina in the 1830s. Nobody had really done any geology there. So this was all brand new. He expanded on this in a very nice book that he wrote, and he mentions this a little bit in his Journal of Researches, but later on he wrote a book about it, which happened to be the first Darwin book I ever read as an undergrad. I used to like browsing in the library. You know, this is the old days before the computer. And way back when I was an undergrad in Hamilton, I was really interested in coral reefs. That was going to be my research area. So, of course, I was looking at the coral reef section of the library, and I went, here's an old blue book, bright blue. So I went, Charles Darwin? He wrote about coral reefs? I had no idea. You know, I was like 22 years old, hey, you know, just a kid. And I sat down and I read that book. And it was the days when professors came and went into the library because that's what they used. And I sat down and I read this book, and I couldn't believe it. The key contribution that Darwin made was not about the corals and things on the coral reefs, but was on the rising and falling of the volcanic cone underneath the coral reef in these volcanic islands in the Pacific. Okay, so the cone would rise, and then the reef would be a terrace here, then the cone would subside, and the reef would be buried or subsided into deep water, or the reef would keep on going, and so that an atoll, the lagoon in the middle of the atoll, is actually overlying a submerged volcano. Now, he, of course, realized this not because he scuba dived or he did seismic profiling. He basically looked at all these islands that they passed by and put it all together, using the theory of Lyell's about the warping and sinking of the crust, and relating that to the growth of coral reefs. And it's absolutely true. It's a remarkable piece of geology. It's astonishing that a 25-year-old kid could come up with this out of the blue, really. Never having been to a coral reef, never gone to holidays in Cancun. Nothing like that at all. It's an astonishing piece of research for him to put all that together. So you can tell that at this point, Charles Darwin is every much a geologist as he was a biologist.